Thank you, everybody. It's great being here. So never know quite where to begin, but I moved here 6 years ago from Los Angeles, and I think I need to update that a little bit as California-based stuff. And this is actually my first lecture here in Connecticut, and my wife said, "You've been here long enough. You got to reach out and meet a few people and what have you." And so I got, very lucky and was invited here. So I started photography, and I guess the way this is going to work, it's not only about me. It's going to be sort of the history of photography mixed in with how I work in that history and where, sort of my technology and processes came from and how they relate, because photography changed about every 20 years or so into a new process, into a new process, into a new process. I guess we're in the digital age, and it's been past 20 years, but now we're in the AI that computers have sort of taken over quite a bit of photography, so that's your new kind of thing. So where's it going to go from here? I don't know either. It's kind of, well, ask Elon, right? Just kidding. So my father, I got interested and started photography as a little itty-bitty kid. My father is a professor of anthropology at the University of Minnesota. He just passed away a year ago, almost exactly, actually. And he was an avid photographer and backed up all his teaching at the university with photographs. And this was before people did that kind of stuff, and slide programs and 16 millimeter movies and all of this kind of stuff. I had a darkroom in my basement when I was 10 years old. He did not do darkroom work. He did slides, sent all this stuff out. I wanted to learn how to kind of make handmade stuff, so I was a little kid. I have horrible dyslexia. So I had problems writing and reading and all that kind of stuff. I was that kid that the teachers came to my father, who's the professor, and says, "Your kid's not trying hard enough," and what have you. So I tried harder by actually, instead of doing book reports, I did a film strip or a slide program or a 16 millimeter or 8 millimeter film. My father had the little crank thing and stuff, and for splicing, and I'd put together my very amateur films and what have you, and tried to story tell that way. And so I got away with what I thought was bloody murder by doing art instead of writing, and I have 2 master's degrees in freshwater biology, but once again, I got through school by simply doing artwork and being able to illustrate my ideas through visual information versus the written word. And I really thought that I was, getting away with stuff. I never felt confident. And so I wound up not actually going into the sciences because I couldn't write. I dictated my stuff to other people and whatever. Now I grab my phone and dictate into my phone, and it's all written out, and for the most part the spelling is correct and what have you, and things have changed completely. I might now not have become a photographer and stayed in biology, which I absolutely loved, and it's part of my work in every way today. And at any time anybody has any questions, I kind of bounce. The problem with this, talking about this stuff, is chicken and egg kind of thing. And unfortunately, I kind of assume that some people know about this stuff more than they might, or I ramble on about something and it's not very interesting, and just say, that's not, move on, anything, just jump in, add your own. I love it. Any questions, I absolutely love, because it gives me direction. And I understand where sort of people are, how they're listening and what have you. I worked at the Getty Museum as their specialist, as I said, in technologies and in the processes, and gave lectures every Wednesday and every Sunday on this stuff, but it was always very specific, normally very specific to one photographer. And the reason that I got the job was because I walked in the footsteps of those photographers. So let's say Carlton Watkins, a very famous photographer that photographed the first real big photographs of Yosemite and photographed with a 18 by 22 inch big camera. Well, I own the same cameras, well, he builds his cameras, I build my cameras. He photographed with certain lenses, I have those lenses. I use the same technology, I print with the same printing processes, albumin prints, and so forth and so on. So when I hear other curators and stuff talk about photography, and they aren't a user of the process. They learned photography in college, and they photographed with a 4x5 camera, not 18 by 22. They've read about wet plate collodion. They've never shot in wet plate collodion in Yosemite. Out in the world, I mean, by walking in the footsteps of those photographers using the same cameras, same lenses, same technology, same everything, you see things from a very different point of view. Why he photographed that from that place, why he didn't photograph in other ways, why all of his images look a certain way. Well, because the process tells you what you can do and what you can't do. Wet plate collodion, which we're going to emphasize quite a bit because it's sort of my love for the last, well, since 1998. I've been working in that process. And so I think, anyways, we're gonna talk a lot about that one and hit other places and how that got invented and what have you. So what was I saying? Anyways, Carlton Watkins photographing with that in the West. Anyways, that's how I got my job. And I photographed in daguerreotypes and so on and so on. I've done all these different processes. So when we talked about the invention of daguerreotypes, the very first patented photographic process, well, I have all of that, stuff, and I'm a big collector. I like things. My house is not minimalist. It's full. It is really full. And I just actually finished, is anything ever really finished? My collection room, and so I have my library in there, so my study, and I have all my cabinets with all my lenses, so I can walk in there and go, what lens haven't I used in a while? And I get inspired by that technology and what that image can produce, or books and what have you, and all of that. So I'm rambling on a little bit. So where did photography start? How did it really come about? Well, it started back, you can go back to the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese and what have you, and photography could have been invented back then. And it just took a few other little sequences, a few other things to happen, and that made it actually viable to make a camera, because there were these things called camera obscuras. They'd walk into a room, you see something upside down and backwards with a little pinhole in it. And there was the understanding of what silver nitrate was. The basis of a lot of these photographic processes, light-sensitive silver. So the Greeks and Romans knew about this, the Chinese, as I said, that silver nitrate. So how did they know about this? What is silver nitrate? You take a silver coin and you accidentally drop it in your barn, and it gets eaten by the nitric acid and the acids that are created by the poop and other things that are in barns, right? And you pull up the coin and you look at it after a while, and it has crystals growing, white crystals growing on the silver coin. Well, then you go and you take it and I'm going to clean up this coin, and you go and wash it in water, and then you step outside in sunlight and your hands are black. Because that's the silver nitrate that has actually turned your hands black. But sunlight is what's necessary to convert the silver into that stuff that stains your hands. Well, that's exactly the same thing that's happening on this paper. That's the stains of the silver nitrate that would be on my fingers, but on the paper instead, in a controlled way running through a negative, which blocks out the light. It's basically a negative. all it is a UV blocker, like cream you're putting on your... And so, silver nitrate was known. There were these boxes that created an upside down and backwards image called camera obscuras. And even in the pyramids, there's a place that has a little hole in the wall that produces an upside down and backwards image on the wall. So there you have that, and you can make small ones. You can use it for drawing. We'll talk about the daguerreotype in a moment, but there was one guy, since we're talking about early drawing technologies, there's a thing called, and I should have brought it today, a camera lucida. And a camera lucida is this cool little device that has a little prism on it, a little piece of glass, prism, right? We all know what that is, right? Little prism, and it sits on a table, and you can sit right here, and it kind of is pointing in that direction, and it produces an image, not on the paper, but on your eye. And there's you have a pencil, and you can draw, and you can see what's in front of you and the piece of paper that you're drawing on at the same time. And you can do unbelievable drawings. There was a guy called John William Herschel, and his fantastic, brilliant scientist, really interesting guy. He that had a lot to do with photography and the invention of photography. We'll talk about him in a little bit. Now he was able to go and take that camera obscura, a camera lucida, and draw with it and make unbelievable drawings. Well, because he was a good artist. He was a good draftsman, as it was called back then. He could take that image that you're tracing and actually make it look like a beautiful drawing. So much so that, anyways, camera lucida, drawing. Oh yes, anyways. There was another guy, Henry Fox Talbot. And Henry Fox Talbot developed one of the other very first positive and negative processes on paper. And Henry Fox Talbot decided to take this camera lucida, this little drawing device, on his wedding to Lake Como. And he thought he was going to make a nice little sketchbook for his wife and on his honeymoon and draw out all this stuff. And he was playing with it, and he just couldn't make the stuff look like Herschel's did. I mean, he just couldn't draw. You know, some of us are really good at drawing and can make a little sketch and it looks beautiful and understood, and some other people just can't. So he just couldn't. And he said, there's got to be a better way to make an image. So he did a little bit of research and what have you. He's a mathematician. He's once again, incredible kind of scientist kind of a guy. He said, and he was a man of means, so he could spend the time to research this kind of stuff. And so he figured out that this stuff called silver nitrate, which we just talked about, could be brushed onto watercolor paper with some salt water. Salt water on paper first, let that dry, brush on some silver nitrate, let that dry, get the percentages right. There's a lot of variables, right? And so you experiment thousands of ways. And he was going to absolutely get this perfect before he introduced it to the world so he could get the claim for creating photography. But he waited too long. We'll get to that in a moment. But he'd brush on the solution, and then he'd take a piece of paper, and then you put in the camera obscura, a box. And his boxes, I should have brought a couple, they were these little boxes with a very simple lens on it, and they were quite often very small. And it's a very slow process because UV light, ultraviolet light that the silver nitrate is only sensitive to, right, gets absorbed by glass. It doesn't like to go through glass. And so it slows down, and it doesn't produce it creates a very slow, hours, days worth of exposure to produce an image on the paper. But then you had this backwards, upside down image, and upside down and backwards, because every photograph in the history of photography produces an upside down and backwards image. Yes, in your digital camera, it's upside down and backwards because the light goes through the lens, crosses over, produces an upside down image, but you have a computer in there that flips it around for you. You got a computer in here that flips upside down the image that's created by your eye and the lens that's in it. It's called your brain. So it flips it around. And so we see correctly. But apparently, I've been told that if you hang a person upside down, anybody wants to experiment with this, I'm open to it. For 5 or 6 days, you hang a person upside down, they start seeing things the correct way. Their brain goes, okay, well, flip this around, and you see, and then you put them back on their feet, and they're walking around as everything's upside down backwards again. So I don't know. I've always wanted to experiment with that, but never had a willing subject. And you can't do that with your own children. It's frowned upon. So I've been told. So here you had Henry Fox Talbot messing around with silver nitrate on paper and working with paper as the producer of images. And then you had another person called Daguerre. And he invented a process called the daguerreotype. And this wound up being actually the first patented photographic process. And I don't know if you can see this. If I get it in the light right, it shines back at you because it's a mirror. It's almost a mirror with a memory, it was called. And it's actually a piece of silver-plated copper. Piece of copper, silver-plated. You can do it on pure copper, but it's, pure silver, but a silver plate's very expensive. So what you do is you take this silver-plated copper and you polish it to the point where it doesn't have the tiniest little scratch. I mean, it's so perfectly polished. It truly, you can't even see the surface of it when you're looking at it. It looks almost three-dimensional. That's how it's polished. It's polished with fine rouges and other things and boards and real art to getting this perfectly polished piece of silver. And what you do is you put that in a box. And there's stuff called iodides and bromides. Those are halides. Halides speed up chemical reactions. Halides are in your neon light tubes and that kind of stuff. You put electricity to them, they get excited and they do things. They accelerate other chemical processes. And so what you do is you take that piece of metal, you put it on top of a box with iodide crystals. And those crystals actually vaporize and they attach themselves to the silver plate. Now you have a light-sensitive image. And you take that and you put it in your camera obscura in your box and you expose it. In the very beginning, daguerreotypes were very, very slow. So almost hours worth of exposures. And they're pretty much ghosts of what people look like in the very, very beginning. You have photographs of a bright city scene where you see the wagon wheels of where the horses were. The horses have moved just enough constantly to, you only see wheels. You see one person sitting there who was asked to sit there and not move. You have a few other things like this, but almost everybody else in the city has just disappeared. I mean, ghost town, because of the long exposure. Well, along came the idea of using another chemical called bromine. And bromine is the Greek word for the nastiest smelling, most disgusting, vile thing that you could possibly, ever smell. A tiny little whiff of it, and it also burns the membranes in your nose. It will melt almost everything. There is a story about a guy doing daguerreotypes in the 1960s where a bottle of bromine was dropped inside his house, and he knew immediately not to inhale, leave the place. He came back and the drywall and the nails the iron had actually rusted and decayed so much that things were falling off of his walls. So he knew that if he took a bottle of ammonia and threw it into the room, the stinky stuff you clean with, and you know how strong of a gas that is, right? That actually is a neutralizer for bromine. So bromine actually speeds things up incredibly. It's that active. So you add iodide crystals and you add bromine crystals after one another, and you layer those, and you get a much more friendly photographic material. And so daguerreotypes were done from the 1830s, 1839, the process was patented. And only weeks later, there were photographs being done in Boston by a guy. And anyways, we don't have to get into all that. But beautiful process, unbelievable detail, and long-lasting. I mean, there are daguerreotypes that I have in my collection that I look at, and they look like they were made yesterday. I mean, they are that pristine and that beautiful. And it's a halide of mercury and silver to produce the image that you're seeing here. And when I say, well, mercury, how did mercury get into that? You mentioned iodides and bromides. Mercury is the developer. So once you've taken it out of the camera, done your exposure, then you take it over to another special box, take mercury, heat the mercury with a little alcohol lamp, and it will create, the mercury is a metal that actually evaporates. Is that kind of strange? Thinking about a metal that evaporates, but it is. It evaporates and creates an image on that silver-plated copper. And that is the very first daguerreotype and first patented process. There were other photographs done before that, but they were kind of one-of-a-kind kind of things, and we won't even get into that, using bitumen of Judea, which is basically tar on a piece of pewter, and using lavender oil as the solvent. And anyways, fun stuff, but we're not going to get into that. Any questions so far?
How did you work out exposures? I mean...
Oh, trial and error. Yeah, sure. Once you've done one, it's overexposed, then it's underexposed, then it's this, then it's that, and you finally hone your way in.
Could you mix your chem to have more or less latitude?
No. No, the daguerreotype process and the wet plate collodion process, I mean, you have some variation in regards to developer and what have you, but for the most part, the speed is in the initial making of the chemistry. And there's silver nitrate by itself in this type of process is just inherently slow. Modern film, not digital, but film, analog, is sped up by making crystal structures that capture light. And so that's a very different technology than the wet plate collodion and the silver nitrate in its most elemental forms, which this uses. So those are the first two photographic processes. Herschel came along, that guy that did the camera lucida thing with the prism that I was telling you about, the guy who could draw really well. Well, Henry Fox Talbot wrote, and Daguerre wrote, I mean, he knew about this process as being sort of being invented, and he said to Henry Fox Talbot they were using strong salt water to fix the image. Now the problem, Henry Fox Talbot, the guy who was making those prints with salt water and silver nitrate, he was having a problem fixing the image. What does that mean? Stabilizing the image, that you could take it out in sunlight or out into a room and show your friends without having to hide it back in the book that, here, take a look. And every time he did that, it'd get exposed a little bit more, and before you knew it, the image had completely gone black, and there wasn't an image on it anymore. And so he was having a problem stabilizing it. A very strong saltwater solution kind of did it, but not in the way that you really wanted. And Daguerre was doing the very same thing with his daguerreotypes when he invented them, a very strong saltwater solution. And it kind of works, but it doesn't really enable you to hang it on a wall. And so Sir John William Herschel comes along, and says, oh, yeah, I got this stuff for you. Oh, I figured this out back 20 years ago, but I didn't know what to do with it. It's a strong silver scrubbing solution, thiammonium sulfate. And this will work perfectly for you. I don't know what dilution, but I figure it's about this. Try it out like this. And so there's these letters written between the gentlemen, and that all of a sudden changed everything. All of a sudden you had the ability to fix an image on paper or on metal like that, and it was stable, as long as you washed all the fixed solution away. It's a very sticky molecule. It doesn't want to be washed away. That's the reason a lot of old photographs fade, is because you just couldn't get it out of the paper. And the way they solved that, some of the parts of that problem was they printed on very, very thin paper. So all these early photographs are on tiny, real super thin, delicate paper, then mounted to boards. Unlike the paper that we use today for, did I say today? For an enlargement analog. See, the problem I have is that I always have to remember that we're way into this whole digital thing. And I don't really shoot digital unless it's on my iPhone. I have a couple digital cameras that I got somewhere. They're just not part of my artistic workflow. Nothing wrong with digital. I'm not anti-digital. It's just not part of how I create my so-called artwork. Just, I need to feel it and smell it and hold it and, create this way. The whole computer thing and sitting there on the desk and stuff, it just doesn't, and digital negatives, and I can get into all of that, and cool technology, but it just isn't kind of for me. What is for me and how this all changed was I had been working since I moved so I grew up in Minnesota. I worked for Prince on the movie Purple Rain. Have you ever seen that? Sure. Okay. So Prince, the artist formerly known, as, okay, and made a kind of a famous movie in Minnesota, and I had a big falling out with him, and he didn't give me credit where I felt that credit was due, and so I moved to California. I showed him. Yeah, I met a ballerina. She said, I'm moving to California. I said, I'm coming with. It was 2 months after meeting her, and I moved to Santa Barbara. Greatest thing I ever did, but biggest change in my life. Long story short, one of the reasons I moved out there was because all of these California photographers, the Ansel Adams, the Edward Westons, the so-and-so, sort of a hub of photography was just slightly north of Santa Barbara where I was living in Carmel. Plus there was a very good photography school called Brooks Photography Institute in Santa Barbara, and I thought, well, maybe I could teach there, whatever, something, maybe that'd be fun. All of that happened, but that's, another thing. I started photographing with big cameras because I found out that the photographers that I really loved looking at their work didn't really do enlargements, they did contact prints. So what is a contact print? Contact print is where you photograph with a big camera and you make a negative, and then you take that negative and place that on top of a sheet of sensitized paper and then shine light through it, and that produces the image. So I'm not using an enlarger because enlargers inherently lose detail. It's direct. The size of all those little molecules of silver and stuff is the size of, guess what? No grain. And I grew up photographing small cameras, 35 millimeter and what have you, and I wanted to try something different, so I started photographing like all the great photographers that I wanted to be, So you emulate, right? And so I got more into big cameras and getting bigger and bigger cameras. The largest camera that I own is a 30 by 44-inch camera, which makes that one seem small. I mean, truly, I can sit inside the camera. I mean, I can go close it up and I'm inside the camera. So I started, well, now what do? I've learned all these wonderful things on how to make all these images, and I've traveling around the world, and I started photographing the girlfriend that I mentioned, the ballerina. She had a family that lived in New Orleans. So I started going to the cemeteries down there with big monstrous cameras. I was about as, incognito as you could. And they said, if you're photographing in the cemeteries in New Orleans, you need a police officer next to you. You hire a police officer to come with you. It was that dangerous. But I think they looked at me photographing with these big cameras and went, that guy's crazy, staying away from him. And they didn't know what those things were, those big boxes and what have you. So I got away with, being able to do it. And as you can see, sort of the brushed on effect of the chemistry onto the paper, and then the contact print, the 16 by 20 inch negative in this case, and all those brush strokes. Well, back in that day, shabby chic was in. Guys, probably some people don't know what that meant, but it's a style of, white, well anyways, we won't get into all of that, but handmade kind of stuff, more handmade look versus the mid-century modern straight line and what have you.
Are we looking at salt prints?
These are actually calotypes. Yes. There's I think I don't have a salt print here. No, I don't. They're calotypes. The prints that I pulled out of the box that I brought, a lot of the stuff I pulled out, I haven't seen in 6-7 years when I packed it, when I moved from California out here. So I just grabbed some stuff, and these were kind of second prints. They have problems, I couldn't sell them. And selling was an important part. I had to make a living with this artwork, and I started going and doing art festivals. Art festivals are street festivals, where you have a tent and you have your art in there and you travel around the United States. So one weekend you're in Florida, the next weekend you're in Chicago, the next weekend you have a show in Denver, and then you're back to Chicago, and then you're on Washington State, and then you're all over the country. Well, what did that allow me to do in the weeks in between? Photograph. I was driving, sometimes it's 2 weeks in between the shows. And I had all my artwork. I didn't deal with galleries. It was like I framed them the way I wanted to frame them. It was a fantastic free gypsy kind of lifestyle. I really loved it. And so then, the buyers from other companies and that kind of stuff would go to these art festivals to see new work and new talent and And so Pier 1 Company, Bombay Company, Restoration Hardware, so and so, all bought the rights to reprint my work, or bought the actual images at great reduced price to sell real artwork in their stores. Yeah, Banana Republic sold the original work right in the windows. I'd walk up, to buy a suit and what have you, and there was, did I buy suits? No. Buy whatever you buy. Anyways, and there was my artwork on the walls. It was like, that was kind of cool. So that was kind of fun. So brushed on silver and iron. And iron is most often on all of these prints. Yes?
So these were paper negatives?
These were not paper negatives, they were film negatives. Yeah, film 16 by 20 inch film negatives. And here is a photograph taken in Guatemala. Yes, I went to places like Guatemala with big monster cameras. If you've ever seen the original Star Wars, the first one, right? You might recognize that, the Temple of the Jaguars, or some Star Wars person tell me what it was the
next one.
Sorry?
New Hope. It's with the rebel base.
The Rebel base, yes. Anyways, here we go. So I'm photographing right at sunset, up right in, there's a staircase, you can actually go right up here. And I'm up there with a big 16 by 20 inch camera, and along comes a guard, and he has a shotgun, and it's well polished from him just standing there all day long, polishing it and rubbing his shotgun. It gleamed, and it's, all the bluing, which are on guns, this blue color, it's rubbed off. Everything's just, and he's just aching for some reason to use it. Well, he takes the gun, and I'm underneath the, looking in the camera, and he's like, whacks me, and he goes, "You're photographing with a limited Spanish I knew at the time. I understood television camera, because it was the one thing he didn't say in Spanish." And he goes, "You're photographing with a television camera." Well, they didn't pay the park, the people who, what's his name, Spielberg? No, for Lucas, yes. For Star Wars, they didn't pay the park any royalties, anything, to film there. And so he was going to win the award for getting a guy photographing with a television camera, because if you look at this side of the camera, guess what it looks like? It looks like a television. It's a big glass screen, and he could just see enough of the image that I was looking at. He said, "That's a television camera." Okay, and so I got I was kicked out of the park and taken to, with the shotgun, taken to the person who runs the camp. He happened to be a photographer. His father was a photographer, owned a portrait studio in Guatemala City. He goes, "Oh no, that's not it." Anyway, so I got permission to go back and photograph and what have you. So anyways, those are silver images. Here's a platinum image, platinum metals instead of silver. And this is underexposed print, and that's the reason I have it still, but it's a good example to have here. As you can see, the details are kind of washed out here. You don't see the wall and what have you, and I wasn't satisfied with the print. But big platinum prints. And here's another, we haven't really talked about lenses and the other cameras and stuff. I'll get into that. How long do I have here? Because I'm just rambling on.
Well, perhaps an hour, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Oh, good.
The question right here.
Oh, yes. What's the question?
The exposure times and all of these.
Well, it all depends if I'm using commercial film, store-bought film, so to speak, or if I'm using the wet plate collodion process. This is store-bought film. But this was photographed with a hypergone lens. It is a 120 millimeter lens that covers 20 by 24. So the lens is this close to the film, 120 millimeters away to the film. And it shoots over here. It shoots down there. This, let's see if I put this right here. Let's see your shoes. The shoes are probably that rock. And that's up over here and all the way over there. And it's super, super wide angle lens. And when you think that was invented in 1890. Where's that? This is Butler Wash, Utah. Butler Wash. Anyways, so I photographed with all these rare optics and that kind of stuff. That was my love and desire. I'm traveling around, going to antique shops, non-camera stores that knew what they were selling. Excuse me. And collecting. And I started collecting all of these cameras. And they're probably down to about 75 large format cameras and about 250 lenses in my collection. So I've whittled it down. But see, I bought all of this stuff before eBay and internet searches. So it just looked like an old lens that nobody knew what it was. Now everybody searches everything, and think they have a treasure because they saw one price on eBay that was, $100,000 for something. Of course, it's been on there for years, and nobody will ever buy that. But yeah, so I was really lucky that I got way ahead of the curve in regards to buying all these historical lenses and cameras. because I couldn't certainly afford, nobody could really afford it now at some of the prices of stuff. Any questions? Yes?
So those are all color types. Do you have an example of a collodion?
Oh yes, that's what we're going to be talking about now. So, photographing all this stuff, printing, selling all over the United States, all the shows, absolutely enjoying it. Then came along digital. And instead of all the brush strokes on the paper being unique, Photoshop could do that. And so other people in art at the art festivals went along and photoshopped their images to look like this and printed on watercolor paper. And then said, oh, I do it the same way he does. Big difference, but you know. And fortunately enough, I was fortunate to win a lot of the contests at these festivals and that kind of stuff. And then, you know, so people just, I mean, I'm sorry, but people lie. And they're doing it the same way I was. So I said, enough of that. And I had enough with, honestly, traveling. I want to be behind the camera more, not in the darkroom as much, printing. I want to be behind the camera more. I want to shoot something that's maybe one of one. And the piece of film is what I sell. So that forces me to produce even more work, which means more work behind the camera, which is the place I really love to be. And along came something I knew about before, the wet plate collodion process. And I have a lot of old books. And all those books have a lot of old recipes in it and that kind of stuff. And so it says process in the normal manner. What does that mean? Old books are written in certain ways in the language, and dacrum, what is a dacrum? So when you're reading the recipes and that kind of stuff of these things, they all have to be deciphered. And so in 1998, I started playing around with the wet plate collodion process. Now, what is the wet plate collodion process? I'm going to go through this real quick. And tell me, how much time do we have left? Just so
15 minutes.
How much?
15.
15? Okay, I'll do this real fast. Okay, so wet plate collodion is collodion, cotton dissolved in nitric acid. There's nothing in this bottle, but pretend there is, okay? And cotton dissolved in nitric acid, it has iodides and bromides. Remember those things that were put on the daguerreotype that fumed up? Remember the things on the silver nitrate that made, on the paper prints? So once again, used in a different way, put into the sticky solution that looks sort of like honey, and it gets poured onto a plate. So you take the plate and you hold it in the corner, the glass plate, and you take your collodion, pour a puddle about this big on the plate, roll it towards your thumb, but do not touch your thumb because your thumb is inherently dirty. Come back over to that corner, drain it off. After it's drained off, and tacky, where you can put your finger on the plate and it doesn't fill back in, then you put it into a bath of silver nitrate. Remember the silver nitrate that was brushed on the paper of the salt print? Well, the same exact stuff in a different solution, a different proportion, get put into a bath of silver nitrate. I didn't bring my big tank of silver nitrate, but I have really big tanks for the really big prints or plates. Put that into the bath of silver nitrate. It sits in there until you pull it up and it's not greasy anymore. It kind of drips off really evenly, about 2 to 3 minutes. Take that out, wipe off the back, and open up what's called a plate holder. And the plate holder is this thing right here. And you open up that door, and it's just a big box that holds the glass plate. And you slide it in there, and then you do that in a dark room. Red light and yellow light you can use, but blue light is what the plate is sensitive to, so you don't use sunlight. Then you take that over and you pull out the ground glass, which is where you focus the image. You pull that out, replace it with the plate holder. Then you take your lens or your lens cap and you pull off the lens cap or expose the plate. Once it's exposed, it's the ISO on it is 0.5, roughly. Sometimes as good as 1 ISO. And on a really bright sunny day with, all the UV where you sunburn, in 10 minutes outside, you get a tan. That kind of a day, much faster. Sunset, much slower. Anyways, put the lens cap back on, take that plate holder, bring it back in the darkroom, take some developer, which is made out of iron. Remember the iron and the silver and all of that as I've been sort of talking about? Those are the main components, the main metals that are used in just different ways. It's kind of amazing. It was just used in different ways, but the same chemistry. Take your developer, pour it on a very special way onto the plate. As it gets on the plate, wiggle it and jiggle it and get it all into all the corners as fast as you possibly can. As soon as the image starts appearing, if you're making a positive called a tintype, I'll tell you about that in a moment, or a negative that you can print with, depends upon the developer solution. Remember, somebody was saying, does it speed up or slow down depending upon how much they change the chemistry? Well, the developing does. You add a lot more density to the plate by developing it longer. Develop the plate, then wash off the plate in water, and then put it in the bath of potassium ferrocyanide. Into basically a cyanide bath. And it's a 1% cyanide bath. And that actually is the fix. Or you can use the fix that I was telling you about that guy Herschel invented in 1819, didn't know what to do with it, and basically made stable all those photographs that you see. You can use either one of them. There are benefits to cyanide in this case, and you soak it in there for a little bit, twice as long as it takes to clear the image. Won't get into all the details there. Then you wash that off, and you come up with an image. Now, historically, you had two types. You had negatives that could be printed with, and all different other processes you could use on paper, or one from the negative. And the interesting thing about wet plate collodion is that when you're making a negative, this is a negative with transmitted light, with light that goes through it. Okay? With reflected light, it's a positive. You can see that looks like a regular photograph. You see a white tree and a black background, right? So it's a negative and a positive at the same time. The silver buildup of on the glass plate is the white, or it's the density material that blocks out the light, so it uses as a negative. It's the same as a silver coin. Look silver down here. Hold it up to the sun, you can't see the sun through it. So both ways. Other than that, a positive and negative, the please, and so it's a positive and a negative at the very same time. It depends how your point of view. You're getting pulled over by the police, maybe not a good thing. You need their help, it's a good thing. So you come up with images that look like this. This is a 12 by 20 inch image. What I use today is actually, I use what is called trophy aluminum. And it's a piece of aluminum that has a painted painted material on it, which creates the black, and then it's fired and what have you. They make trophy plaques with this. They engrave on this black material. I was the very first person to use this trophy material as the modern wet plate collodion norm. More people photograph now on wet plate collodion on this material than any other material, than on glass, because glass has to be cleaned and it's notoriously difficult for the collodion, that sticky stuff floating off of it, and other problems. And it breaking piece of glass. We just had a big 25 by 30 inch image break when I was setting up here today, unfortunately. So nice aluminum, and cuts out one other part of the process that I would do. Now, the original tintypes were never done on tin. They were done on iron, asphalted iron. Remember the very first photographic process that I've told you about that was sort of asphalt, used oil of lavender to make, well, once again, asphalt. So all of these materials used in different ways is really fascinating. But exactly the same thing as this, but this is on a piece of blackened aluminum, and here you have the same thing on what was called a tintype. Why was it called a tintype if it was on iron and never on tin? If you were a tinsmith, you worked with sheet metal. This is sheet metal. It's just a slang term. It's actually not on tin. It's on asphalted iron, but tinsmith meant you worked on tin, so everything on sheet metal is called tin, because a tinsmith worked with sheet metal. So it's just one of those terms that's actually incorrect. Here are a couple other really big, photographed with that camera you see there. So just bigger cameras, 22 by 30 inches. And I just grabbed these from when I moved from California out here. Instead of moving with the frames and all the glass, I took everything out of the frames. And those are just two of that. So what is this thing? Yeah, it photographs two images at the same time. So like your eyes, one is over here. Now if we just move back and forth a little bit, you can see that if you're just a few inches over to one side or the other side, you sort of see behind that person in front of you just a tiny little bit, you know? And so by creating an image that has two images on one card and then putting it in a special holder, you're able to look at it and it looks three-dimensional. It looks so three-dimensional, it can fake, I mean, really, it's really believable when you look at a good stereo image done in the right way. And they became so popular in the mid to late 1800s that if you had any money at all, you'd go off and you'd buy these cards, and they went all over the world photographing with stereo images. Maybe more stereo images were made, and they're the bread and butter of photographers. Carl Watkins did it. I mean, other major photographers photographed the stereo because there was a market for it. And these were made by the millions. And you can go to any antique shop, anywhere, and ask them if they have any stereo images, and you'll find them. I mean, there are that many of them. And if you get the little holder, try it sometime, look through this thing, and it is believable. You think that rock is just right there, three-dimensional in front of you, or a tree, because it's just that tiny little two things, spaced the same as your eyes. Spaced almost identical. And this is a French camera made in the 1860s for wet plate collodion. And remember I was telling you about all the silver nitrate stains that were created? You can always tell a wet plate collodion camera if it has been used for wet plate, because it'll always have inevitably little black marks on it from the wet plate collodion. I'll tell you real quick about this camera, and then I'll open up to questions. This camera was a camera that I built after my very favorite Scoville Adams cameras. It's basically an identical replica of the camera that I, for instance, went to Holland with and photographed, for instance, this image. It produces a 14 by 17 inch image. It's my favorite go-to size. Yeah, that's my go-to size. It's small, yet big. It holds a wall really nicely. 16 by 20, just that much more to carry around. And just that fewer lenses that cover it that I have in my collection. And so 12 by 20, this size right here, and 14, 17 are by far my go-to size. I like bigger stuff, but it's just that much more difficult. And as a traveling photographer out in the field, 14 by 17 just works beautifully for me. So this camera was built with chestnut, and this chestnut was torn out of my house by the people installing the insulation. And they put it in a burn pile. They were going to take it off and burn it. And I was like, no, that's my house, my 1790 house. And I came from California, which 1790 houses don't exist. And so I just said, I'm going to build a camera with it to photograph Connecticut with a wood that is, so there was a chestnut blight in the early 1900s. By 1920, almost no chestnut trees existed. And so the blight killed all of them. And it was the #1 wood for building floors, houses, everything in New England. There were 50% of the forest were chestnut trees at one point in certain areas. And these trees were huge. The reason under the chestnut tree and what have you, sung in Christmas carols and what have you. This was a very common tree. It was the most important tree. It was an industry for the food. Incredible stuff. So I couldn't throw out the wood, and there were all these little pieces. And so I built a camera with it. And now I'm going to be shooting a series of images in Connecticut with a tree that came from my house, which I kind of recycled camera. So panoramic, move the lens, big curved piece of film that goes in the back here, produces a very wide angle shot with a tiny little slit, and as that moves, it's photographing just a little bit. And so you can elongate tires as you're photographing, because it's moving, and the car is moving down the road, and so you can have a very long car with big oval wheels and that kind of stuff on it. Anyways, okay, questions? Yes?
I'm a little confused. I've done a little bit of wet plate, but if you're shooting for a big piece of glass, you're saying that that same piece of glass can be a negative or a positive?
It is a negative and a positive, depending upon the substrate or how you're viewing it. If it's on a piece of glass, you're viewing through the image to print with it. And that's black. And that creates the black. They were not only using black glass back then, but sometimes red glass. And I don't know if you can see here with the light coming through it. This is what's called a ruby type. It's a piece of red glass, sort of a purpley red. And that produces an image on the surface versus on clear glass, which is behind and presented to the viewer by looking through clear glass. This is on the surface of the red glass. And it was the most expensive. It was double to triple the price of one on clear glass.
So this was actually made on the ruby glass?
Yes, this is on, I don't know if you can see. Can you see that?
Well, sort of. The light is killing me.
Well, that's the whole point. You have to see through, and you see how that's a negative as well as a positive.
Yeah, a lot of times antique stores don't always know what they have.
Yeah.
And if you don't look at the back to take it out.
Yeah,
They may be selling it as a daguerreotype.
Well, the biggest difference with the daguerreotype, and it's real obvious side by side, is the one is a mirror. The daguerreotype, which is silver-plated copper, is a mirror. And it looks quite often at different angles like it is a negative. But it's that strange amalgam of tiny molecules of silver and mercury. And yes, a lot of early photographers had a few problems with inhaling too much mercury.
Luther, I've heard collodion was used in the Civil War and bandaged up.
Yes, exactly. Collodion was used in a lot of different ways. It was actually called gun cotton, nitrated cellulose. So nitrated cellulose is incredibly flammable. And so when it's manufactured with sulfuric acid and nitric acid dissolving cotton balls, so it's cotton balls dissolved, and then it turns into, when it's washed to get rid of the acid, put into water, it turns into little cotton balls. So if you mix collodion, fresh collodion with, anyway, I won't get into all that. It actually goes back into cotton balls initially. But yeah, you take that dried cotton and you light it, or you pour a collodion onto paper, and we've all gone to a magic show where the person lights a piece of paper and it burns so fast that you can't, I mean, how did he get it to burn that fast? That's collodion on paper. So it's very flammable. It was called gun cotton. It was the dynamite before dynamite was invented. Yes?
I have a quick question about the collodion. So photographers like Julia Cameron
Yes.
and Sally Manning, that they'll often get prints on their fingerprints.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious what camp you're in artistically.
Oh.
Pristine, or does it matter to you that things have those imperfections, let's say your fingerprint? It's so pretty, it's so beautiful.
Okay, the question is, there were photographers that highlighted the, and a lot of modern photographers do that, highlight the problematic process that wet plate collodion is. Remember I told you to take a piece of glass, you pour on the collodion corner to corner. Well, what happens if you miss that corner? What happens if it's too thick in one corner and very thin in the other corner? What happens when you pour the developer on, which is the main problem, you pour the developer and you don't get it on that even. And then you have to shake it around and try to get it on all the corners, and every time you jiggle it and wiggle it, you're making other lines and artifacts of process. And those artifacts of process were desired by some people, as in a modern photographer called Sally Mann, who made this process much more popular than it was. When I started photographing wet plate collodion, there were 5 people in the world doing it for Civil War reenactments, and nobody else doing it except for dabbling in it. And pretty much everybody was doing it for portraits. Nobody was doing it in the field, for landscapes and that kind of stuff. Julia Margaret Cameron, Sally Mann was working with this. I learned the process by reading old books and then going to a workshop by Mark Osterman, and who was the preeminent wet plate collodion expert at the time, and honed my skills because, as I said, in those old books, you have diagrams, there aren't any photographs in them, there's not videotape, there's not Instagram on, there isn't YouTube, there's none of this, so I'm, learning by this old book that says process in the normal manner. Well, and other things, and I mean, it was difficult learning in a historical book. Once you've learned the process and then you're reading the historical book, it makes sense. But they figured that you knew something, you must know a little bit more to be reading this book than starting off from scratch and stuff. So I went and honed my skills with him with a week-long workshop in Missoula, Montana at the Formulary. And then I was off. Then it was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. It's really, it's a beautiful process. It is one of one. That's frustrating, but you can make negatives. But nowadays, you make digital prints with it. And a lot of Julia Margaret Cameron's work, she blows them up to 40 by 50 inches. And because this process, though it is an antique process, has the highest resolution of every other photographic process except one. And it's molecules of silver on a piece of glass. You don't have any grain. You can take an image this big and blow it up, and since it's molecules are so small that if you're floating just right there on the edge of outer space, you see the United States, and then you see a state, and then you see a city, and then you see a football field, and you see a blade of grass with a water drop in that football field. That's how small a molecule is. Pretty small. So these molecules are silver, so you can enlarge that with absolutely incredible resolution. And my new assistant Andrew over here. We're going to be working this summer on a project that I've been very excited about kind of developing over the last 6 years. When I moved out here, we have 2 children, new house, new total environment, building a darkroom, 800 square foot darkroom. I have Cole Weston, Edward Weston's other son, enlarger in it, 8 by 10 inch Saltzman. And I've all the other stuff and finishing the house and blah, blah, blah. Haven't done really much photography, few things. And I have developed, built, and redesigned optics, and that change completely the way the light works on the plates. Kind of wraps around trees, kind of magically shimmers and moves, and extremely interested. And I'll be actually shooting small, 8 by 10, putting those into the enlarger and then enlarging those to silver gelatin prints. And that's what we're going to be working on this summer. Yes?
So you mentioned the optics. Is that something that you also create, or is this?
Well, I use historical lenses and then take them apart, reconfigure the way the glass sits. I use a wood lathe to develop the barrels instead of a brass barrel to hold the glass. And I've switched things around a little bit, intentionally not making them as good as they were. Trying to, they're soft focus, but they're not really, they're sharp, but they're not really, anyways, just playing with them. And so I'm really excited about doing this project with Andrew this summer, and then using the big Saltzman enlarger, and my darkroom has 4 by 6 foot trays in it, which are sinks. And so they're all plumbed separately, so I'm able to fill up them with chemistry and make some big, really big, fun big. Because with this resolution, you're able to, it looks like this, but only this. And it has the same amount of details, same amount of everything in it. Except that it's going through a lens, which changes things. So anyways, I'm putting some of these strange lenses on the enlarger and just playing, once again playing, and see where I go, And it's amazing how you got wet plate collodion photography here, wet plate collodion photography here. He said he dabbled, another one here. When I started out, as I said, there were maybe 10. I was part of a collodion forum, and there were just, it was a small community. And it's amazing how many people, and that's partially a couple different reasons. Workshops it grew from a few seeds, but also because of Instagram and Facebook, and it's cool, it's accessible, but to master it, not so easy. And it's just, anybody that wants to take a workshop and what have you, I have the big dark room, I have the cameras, I have any size you want to work with, and just come over and play. And so you're all invited. For millions of dollars, of course. So, any other quick questions? Yes?
How do you cure the varnish on your big plate?
I'm sorry, say again?
How do you cure the varnish on your big plates?
That's a good question. They're all different. What he's talking about is once you've made the photograph of one of these wet plate collodion images, if you would go in and touch the silver, it would rub off on your fingers. And you can scratch it, and it also oxidizes. If you've ever picked up one of these ambrotypes or tintypes at an antique shop and they look really bad, it's normally because they weren't varnished. So you have to put something over the top of it to seal the oxygen from interacting with the silver, because we've all had a silver coin or teapot that's oxidized and turned black. Well, that's exactly what would happen. because it's pure elemental silver. It's not sterling. It's pure silver, like it's mined out of the ground. And so you have to put a varnish over the top of it. And there were a couple traditional ways. One was using a type of shellac, which is made out of bugs. And did you know that M&Ms, the reason they're shiny is because they have shellac, which is made out of bugs, over the top of them? I know I've just ruined everybody's tree, but yes. So shellac is used, and or gum sandarach, which is a resin like pine sap, tree sap, from the sandarach tree that's called the ghost tree. It's actually from the Middle East. And supposedly Jesus Christ was crucified on those cedar pieces. Well, that's actually the gum sandarach tree. And it's a holy tree. It's a whole bunch of different things, but it does create a resin that you take and you dissolve it in 190 proof grain alcohol and ball mason jar and shake it up while you're watching TV, and then it dissolves, but you look at the bottom of it and there are bits of bark and ground and things and bugs and flies like amber, you know, and all that kind of stuff in there, and then you decant it out, and then you filter it through cotton balls, and over and over and over and over again to get a completely clear solution. And then you pour that onto, so what you do is you take your plate and you warm it up over alcohol lamp. That's the reason I brought this one. And you heat it up over that, and when you put your hand underneath the plate, and you can almost have it too hot to where, but you can still touch it. Then you know the temperature is right, and hopefully you have a nice even temperature on the entire plate, so you don't want to do it too fast. And it's 190 proof grain alcohol that you're going to be pouring with resin that's flammable on top of a light. So you don't pour it over the alcohol lamp, like one of my students did immediately after I told him not to do it. And that's another story. Flames and screaming people and, oh God, horrible. Anyways, so put that on and pour on the gum sandarach varnish in the same manner, one corner, drain it off very, very carefully, real smoothly, almost horizontal, because this stuff is the most difficult part of the process, and it's the very last part of the process to get even. And any dust that's on that plate, anything that, you know, it wants to gum up, it wants to dissolve the plate that you're pouring it on if your collodion doesn't have enough strength to it. So very difficult part of the process. So how do I do these big plates? Secrets of the trade. No, no, in basically the same way. The thing is that I have just a much larger heat source and years of practice and my own recipe for gum sandarach. Yeah, these are gum sandarach. And some people use plastic sprays and that kind of stuff, water-based polyurethanes and stuff. And so there are all different ways you can do this. There are historically correct ways, and we know that last, or we think they last. And yet on the other hand, at the Getty Museum where I used to work, we have all these fun tools which we can accelerate aging. And so I took water-based polyurethane and accelerated aging it on top of a plate like this, and did the same with gum sandarach. Well, guess which yellowed first? Gum sandarach. Stick the gum sandarach varnished image in your window in your car, and I guarantee you it'll turn yellow, even within a day. And the polyurethane never changes. It's plastic. It's like, so don't tell Mark, but it works. That said, most of these are gum sandarach or other things, and because it has a more yellow, warm tone to it. Anyways, there's just so much you could get into. I could spend all night talking to you and not cover half of it in regards to just that one process.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.